morning, everybody. My name's Alex and I live in Yorkshire in the UK. And this is a little mini-sode series all about this fabulous cardigan that I'm wearing. You seem really high there. So let me show you it first before we get into chatting. Oh, I will link the pattern in the description box below. And all of the information about where you can find me will be linked in the description box below this video as well. So, are we ready? I've got straight into it this time, haven't I? So this is the cardigan. I am so pleased with it. I'm really pleased with these buttons. Here, if you can see that, it says My Yarny Corner. They were a lovely gift from Jeanette at Crafty Clegs Creations. So this is the cardigan. And we'll have a chat. So this was actually my first ever attempt at knitting any kind of garment flat, and I was really nervous, but I had a couple of reasons, well, one reason only for knitting a cardigan flat. I've not made many garments, but the ones that I have made, the majority of them, I've not been happy with them. And the reason I've not been happy with them is nothing to do with any of the designers. It's all boiled down to gauge and fit. That's kind of the same thing because the fit is based on gauge and me not knowing enough about it. So after a few failed attempts at different garments over the past few months, I kind of thought to myself, I need to go back to basics. I need to learn knitting back to basics. Now, knitting patterns years ago used to be quite basic and they expected you to know, a lot about knitting, whereas nowadays a designer kind of holds your hand. But I kind of think it's great that knitting patterns now hold your hand, but the major thing people forget to take into account is gauge, and that is the most important part of any knitting pattern. You wouldn't sew a garment without measuring, so this is what I wanted to learn, and I tried to get my head around it by knitting in the round, but I just wasn't getting it. So I thought, if I knit a pattern flat and I'm concentrating on each piece, I'm going to learn something. And I'm pleased to say that it absolutely worked. Now, I was very nervous. I've never knit anything flat before. I was really concerned about sewing it together. I best tell you what the pattern is. The pattern is Kinko 5596, and it's this one. When you buy the pattern, you also get the long line cardigan and the snud as well. So initially this was the one that I was going to be doing. It's a double knit pattern, and obviously it's knit flat. You work from the bottom up and you knit each piece separately. So you knit the back and then you knit both of the fronts and then you knit the sleeves and then you sew it all together. Now, YouTube has helped me massively here. Any video that I talk about in this video, I will link below. So all the tutorials that I've mentioned, I will link in the description box below as well. So I started off wanting to knit the long line version. I did my gauge swatch. I did get gauge. Now, this is the part where I've never had a problem. I've always known to do a gauge swatch, and I did get gauge. So that was fine. I could use the recommended needles. I made the size 2, which is... I haven't got the... Oh, yes, I have. Size 2 is 44 3/4 inches, so it was giving me just over 4 inches of positive ease, which, as you can see, is what I've got. I do like a few inches of positive ease. So I looked at the long line version and I had this gauge in my head the whole way. So I decided, based on the stitch count, the row count of the cardigan, I'd work out how long it was supposed to be, because I always say I'm short, but I think I'm average height. I'm 5'4", but anytime I buy anything like a long cardigan, it's always very long on me. So I thought I best just check. And based on the measurements, it would have come down past my knees, which is not something I want in this yarn. This yarn's quite a heavy yarn. So I've used my Yarny Corner yarn, and it's 100% merino hand-dyed yarn. But it's quite heavy. If I was doing it in acrylic, it's much lighter, so I could have made the long one, but I think this would have stretched. So I opted then for the shorter one. Now, the shorter one, as you can see, has got 3 buttons. So this really worried me. Normally with a cardigan, I don't put buttons on. But with this style, it needs it, because otherwise these fronts are just going to flap about. So that was in my head. Anyway, I got on with knitting, and I knit the back first, and then I knit one of the fronts. And I presumed with knitting that you would just hold right sides together and sew them together. And that's the first thing that I did, by joining the cardigan front with the back. No, that's not what you do. When I opened it out, there was just holes everywhere. I thought, well, that's not a good look, is it? So my first problem I came across was actually joining these seams. And it seems to be the one that I use, the tutorial, it has you laying the cardigan pieces right sides up in front of each other. So you've got the back here and the right front here. So you lay them flat. And on one side, you go into half of 2 stitches. So you've got, you've got your V's. So you go into half of one stitch and half of the next stitch. And on the other side, you go into both V's. I will link this tutorial below. Once I did that, I got the most amazing seam. I don't know if you can see it with my hair. It was so much neater, and I was really, really pleased with it. So that was my first problem that I came across. How do you join these things? Because as a new knitter, I could knit, but I could knit basic stitches. I only learned to properly knit in 20 to 2021. So all these techniques are completely new to me. And these are the things I have never learned. So that was my first problem. I learned how to do that. I went on to the sleeves next. Now, when I was knitting the sleeves, it had asked that you knit for 17 3/4 inches. Now, my arms are not that long. They're really not that long. And I said to Danny at the time, this sleeve's going to be too long. Maybe I should take it to only knitting to 16 inches. Once you've done all your increases, you've got to knit it to 17 3/4 inches, I think it was. And I thought, no, maybe I should knit it to 16. And Danny said, well, you don't know how it's going to affect it with the seam, because I'd never put a sleeve in. Obviously, this is a dropped shoulder. He said, just stick with the pattern for now until you sort of understand how it works a little bit. So I did stick with the recommendation measurements of the pattern, and my sleeves are a little long, which is why I've got the cuff folded up. But that's something that I needed to learn. I needed to understand how patterns worked. I did sort of think at the time, if it's too long, I can just fold up the cuff. And I actually really like that. And if it's cold, I can just fold it down and, really cover my hands, which I also like to do. But that's not a big thing. That's not a big thing at all. And it was just something that I had to learn, I think. Setting in the sleeves was a real challenge. So when you knit flat, you've got sleeve shaping. Obviously, I've only ever knit in the round, and I usually knit top down raglan. So you knit, and then you separate for the sleeves. So you put the sleeve stitches onto waste yarn and you just carry on down the body, and that's your sleeve pretty much done. So these sleeves were obviously flat, and then you've got this, a lot like in sewing, the sleeves kind of go like that. which is what I'm not a sewer, but it's what I've seen with sewing patterns. So I kind of thought, oh, how is this going to work? So I did find another tutorial, and again, it was not difficult. It really was not difficult. The tutorial was really well explained. You fold the sleeve in half. Obviously, you know where your centre point is on your seam because you've already joined your back to your front. So you fold your sleeve in half, you mark your centre points, and then the tutorial talks you through how to actually sew that sleeve. And I think I've done a really good job. It wasn't difficult. When I joined the first front, the first one took me 3 attempts. The sleeves went straight in. I had no problems. First time, straight in. So again, that was absolutely fine. So by this point, I'm thinking to myself, why have I been so nervous about doing this? Everything was, I wasn't worried about it fitting at any point. I could clearly see it was going to fit. One of the big worries that I had with a knit flat pattern was, well, you can't try it on as you go. So how do you know if it's going to fit? Because you've just got all these pieces. But I wasn't concerned. Once I got that first front join to the back, I could see that it was going to fit. So I wasn't worried about that. I was, however, really, really concerned about this button band. Very, very concerned. I have joined a button band a couple of times in the past, and what's happened is the front of the cardigan has kind of curled up, and I thought, oh, it's really going to spoil it if that happens. And I just thought that's what happened with button bands. I didn't realise that was something I was doing. So I went searching on YouTube again and came across a fantastic video. So when you pick up button bands, I did know that you didn't pick up every single stitch. I was aware of this. But this particular pattern didn't tell you how many. I think if the pattern would have said to me, pick up every 3 stitches out of 4, I would have done that. But it didn't. It said pick up stitches evenly, and it gave you a number of stitches that you had to have. So I had to do some research. So I found this tutorial, and the lady was showing the different types of mistakes that can happen when you make a button band. And these are the mistakes that I've come across in the past. So it was like a light bulb moment. Oh my word, wow. So I had, I watched the video all the way through first so I could get my head around what she was saying. And then I went back and I followed along with her while I did the math. So it turns out when you do a button band, where you pick up stitches, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm very new to this, but this is what I understand from the video that I've watched, and it worked perfectly. Where you pick up stitches is based on your own gauge. So if you've knit a pattern and you've not matched the designer's gauge, and this is the problem that I've had in the past, I've made a cardigan and it was not the designer's fault. I paid no attention to gauge and my button band looked horrendous. If you haven't, and I didn't match the designer's gauge, if you haven't matched the designer's gauge, if you pick up the button band as the designer says, that's based on their gauge. So you're going to run into some problems. So there was a ratio to be worked out, and the way that you do this is the way that you work out maths when you're doing a swatch. So you take 3 inches of your stitch count and you count how many stitches you've got in 3 inches, and then you do the same for the row. Then you divide each of those numbers by 3 and that will give you a ratio, and that's the ratio that you use to pick up your button band. So in my case, my ratio was 7/8. So for every 8 stitches I picked up 7 stitches and then skipped the 8th. That worked brilliantly. So you started off picking up the stitches at the back of the neck. You've got a few stitches on hold at the back of the neck with a centre stitch. So you start there, and then it said, I don't know, I won't give the exact number out, but say for example, it said pick up 100 stitches down to the end of the decreases, which would be here. When I did my ratio and I picked up the 100 stitches, it was exactly there. So this was a really good sign. And then it would say pick up 40 stitches from here to here on the flat bit. And that was exactly right. So I knew that something was going well. And if you look, if I just undo my buttons, there we go, that'll do. You can see that it's not flaring. I'd have to undo the top one to show you as well. You can see that it's not flaring, it's sitting exactly flat. There's no puckering up, there's no problems whatsoever. So it worked really, really well, and I was so pleased. Now, adding the buttons, I didn't follow a tutorial. I looked at some tutorials, and one of the tutorials says you add a button on the back, and I thought, I'm not doing that. So I just sewed the buttons on. If they fall off, I'll re-sew them on, but I think I've done okay. But all that was to say, it was just an absolute joy. I am so pleased. That colour looks different here. It's not. It's the light. It was just an absolute joy to knit. It really was. And I'm so pleased that I've gone for it and done it. If any of you have been watching the February vlogs, this has been the talk of the February vlogs. So I apologise for that. And thank you if you're watching this video again. But so many people have made comments in those videos saying, oh, I'm too scared to knit flat. But you learn such a lot, and I would highly recommend it. If you're like me and you've been having problems with getting things to fit and not understanding things, give it a go knitting flat, because what you'll learn, even if it doesn't work out, even if you can't possibly sew them seams together, get some cheap yarn and just give it a go, because what you'll learn is so much more than just having that finished product. So now when I go to knit anything in the round again, I'm going to pay much more attention. Like I say, I've always done a gauge swatch, but I'm going to be looking at armhole depth and using my gauge to work out exactly where that, because I never get gauge. This is the other thing, sorry, I'm digressing here a little bit. I'm an English style knitter, and what I find is I like a lot of the patterns that are knit by continental knitters. And that means, because I'm an English style knitter, which makes me quite a tight knitter, and the designer is usually a continental knitter, which makes them quite a loose knitter, I never get gauge. So I'm always playing with needle sizes in order to match gauge. So in future, I'm going to be looking at armhole depth and where my gauge, what my gauge would give me on armhole depth. And that's really easy to work out. If you've done your gauge swatch, you can work out how many rows per inch and how big that's going to be. I'm going to be looking at sleeves, because that's another bugbear I've had. Baggy sleeves. I don't mind baggy sleeves, but some of them, you can't roll them up when you're washing up because they fall down. This is perfect. It's not tight, but it's not baggy either. This is absolutely perfect. And this is another thing that I'm going to be looking at when I knit my next knit in the round garment. All those sorts of things. And now I feel like, because I've done this one, I'm much better armed with information about going forward with my knitting and understanding my own gauge and being able to make modifications. Sometimes, well, quite a lot of the times at the moment, what I'm seeing on Ravelry is a lot of the garments are very, very cropped, because they're designed to be worn, with the beautiful dresses, which look amazing, but I don't wear dresses. So I need something a little bit longer. And I would just before just keep knitting, but now I know if I'm following my own gauge, I could, you know, do some modifications and decrease a little bit so it's not as baggy on the waist. Or if the armhole depth, like the ranunculus, I love the ranunculus and I have made a couple of them. I do wear the one, I've made a long sleeve one and a short sleeve one. Now, I did realise on the ranunculus it has quite a deep armhole depth, and I did take one of the repeats off and I kind of just winged it, and it worked. But in future, I'm going to be able to think, right, okay, I know now where my gauge is, where that's going to be. I've learned a lot about gauge, so I know how many rows I want that yoke depth before I separate for sleeves, and I'm going to be much more armed with information, So, and actually, I have discovered I quite like knitting flat. One of the biggest things that I had was how quick it was. You know, you've just got back stitches on, or you've just got the front stitches on. You know, you're not knitting all of the body stitches all at the same time. So what I found I could do was knit the back and then have a little bit of a break. I felt like I'd made progress, and have a little bit of a break, knit on a pair of socks or whatever, and then come back to it and start the front. And I really felt like I made progress. But I could knit on other things as well. And it wasn't such a chore having 350 stitches on the needle. I can't remember how many stitches I had on the back, but it wasn't that many. So I was able just to whiz through. It was really, really easy. So yeah, I'm so pleased with it. It's my first, like I say, my first knit flat pattern. And this is a Kinko one. There are many, many different ones that you could do. And if you are on the fence and you're wondering about how you would cope, I will link every single tutorial that I used. There were only 2 or 3, I think. It wasn't like I sat on YouTube for hours looking for tutorials. It was just bits of information. I thought, oh, how do you do that? I will link those videos in the description box below. And let me know your thoughts. But I am going to enjoy wearing this. I really am. It's just fabulous. I love the colour. It's just, oh, it was a joy. It was an absolute joy. It did have a lot of ribbon on it. I can't remember how much, but you can see how much ribbon is there. There was a lot of ribbon. But it was fine because there weren't a lot of stitches on it, so it was no problem at all. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little mini-sode series. Let me know your thoughts on flat knitting, and if you've ever done it, or if it's all you do, or something you'd never do in a million years. Let me know your thoughts. I would be really, really interested to see. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you on the next mini-sode series. Bye-bye.